Welcome to Seductive Chronicles. Today's story doesn't begin with a scream. It doesn't begin with a door slamming or a voice raised in anger. It begins the way the most dangerous stories always do, with silence. With a car winding higher into the mountains. With a hand resting gently on a thigh. With a smile that reveals absolutely nothing. If you're someone who feels things deeply, who reads between lines, who notices the pause before an answer, who has ever loved someone and wondered if you truly knew them, then stay right here. Because what you're about to hear is going to linger. It's going to press against something inside you long after this video ends. This is not a story about betrayal in the traditional sense. It's something far more unsettling. It's a story about the slow, careful dismantling of everything you assumed was certain. My name is Megan Harper. I'm 35 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I lived inside a marriage I believed I understood completely, until one weekend in the mountains stripped that certainty away like bark from a tree, layer by quiet layer, until what remained was something raw, something true, something I could never unsee. Let me take you back to the beginning, because context matters here. Every story has a foundation, and ours was built in Seattle, a city that always seemed to reflect our relationship back at us. Rain-slicked streets, gray skies broken open by unexpected warmth. The kind of city that keeps its secrets tucked beneath its surface while still managing to feel intimate. Even romantic. Adrien and I had been married for 8 years when this story takes place. 8 years of shared routines, shared dinners, shared silences, that we had both learned to read and inhabit comfortably. From the outside, we were steady, solid, the couple that other couples quietly envied. But inside our marriage, beneath the nice apartment and the comfortable income and the years of accumulated familiarity, there was always a current, a low hum, something electric that never quite resolved itself into stillness. I used to think that tension was passion. I used to believe that the constant sense of leaning forward in our relationship, the feeling that we were always on the edge of something, was proof that we were alive in a way that other couples weren't. I understand now that I was only half right. The tension was real. But passion was only one of its ingredients. Adrien Harper was, and I say this with full awareness of how complicated. It sounds one of the most difficult people I have ever tried to describe. Charismatic falls short. Attractive doesn't capture it. When Adrien walked into a room, the room adjusted. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in subtle, undeniable ways. Conversations softened. Eyes drifted. Attention reorganized itself in his direction without anyone consciously deciding to give it. He was 38 years old and wore his age the way certain men do, as if time had made a quiet agreement with him. Agreeing to refine rather than diminish. Everything about him was deliberate. His clothes, his words, the precise amount of information he chose to share in any given moment. He worked as an event planner, though that title always felt like an underdressing of what he actually did. Adrien didn't organize events. He engineered experiences. He understood atmosphere the way composers understand music, not just what sounds to include, but what silences to leave, and where. Lighting, pacing, anticipation, revelation. He treated each one like an instrument capable of shifting the emotional temperature of an entire room. Clients came to him not just for weddings or corporate galas, but for the moments that carried weight, proposals, milestone reunions, private celebrations, where the feeling of the evening mattered more than any detail of the decor. He had a gift for making people feel something they didn't know they needed to feel. And somewhere along the way, watching him do exactly that, I fell in love with him, completely. Perhaps naively. Perhaps both. But here is the thing about loving someone who thrives in implication. You spend a significant portion of your life living in the space between what is said and what is meant. Adrien rarely explained himself directly. He preferred to let meaning arrive on its own schedule, to let curiosity do the heavy lifting. And I, perhaps because I loved him, perhaps because I trusted him, Or perhaps because some part of me found that mystery intoxicating, never pushed as hard as I should have. The trip was his idea. A secluded mountain retreat, he said, somewhere isolated. Somewhere the noise of ordinary life couldn't follow us. When he described it, his eyes held that particular spark I had learned to recognize over 8 years. The one that meant something had already been set in motion. Something planned, structured, considered. This will be unlike anything we've done before, he said, his voice low and certain. The way it always was when he'd already made a decision and was simply allowing me to catch up to it. I believed him. What I didn't realize was exactly how unlike anything we'd done before it truly was. It wasn't until I started packing that the questions began to surface. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, one by one, the way doubts tend to arrive, slipping in through the gaps in certainty. This isn't just us, is it? I asked, folding sweaters into my suitcase, keeping my voice casual, hoping the question sounded lighter than it felt. Adrien leaned in the doorway watching me. His smile, measured, unhurried, told me nothing. I've invited a few people. How many? A small group. He crossed the room in that quiet, deliberate way of his, and brushed a strand of hair back from my face. His touch was warm, grounding, familiar in all the ways that made my instincts go soft when they should have stayed sharp. Trust me, Mag. He always knew when to use my nickname. He always knew exactly how much reassurance was needed and how little explanation was required. And I nodded, because I did trust him. Because 8 years had built something in me that leaned toward him instinctively, even when the rest of me wasn't sure it should. The drive into the mountains felt like crossing a threshold that had no visible marker. Cell service faded somewhere around the second hour. The road narrowed until it felt less like infrastructure and more like an interruption in the wilderness. A thin line carved through something vast and indifferent. Snow dusted the ridges. Pines crowded both sides of the road, their branches heavy, their darkness absolute. Adrien drove with quiet focus, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on my thigh, warm and still. Every few miles, he glanced at me with an expression I couldn't fully decode, something between reassurance and anticipation, as if he were already watching the outcome of a story I hadn't yet read. "You're thinking too much," he said at one point, softly, without looking away from the road. "Am I?" "Yes. Stop. I've already thought it through." That sentence should have unsettled me more than it did. Looking back, it contained everything I needed to understand about what was coming. The lodge materialized from the forest like something that had always been there, like the trees had simply grown around it, accommodating its presence without question. It was massive, dark timber-bird, built of stone and intention. A clearing had been carved from the wilderness around it, and in that clearing, the structure stood with the particular gravity of a place that has witnessed things. The cold outside was sharp and clean. The air tasted of pine and altitude and something older underneath, something mineral. Ancient UNNAMAABL. Inside. Warmth met us immediately. The ceilings vaulted overhead, supported by great timber beams that arched like the bones of something enormous and sleeping. Stone walls held the light of a fire large enough to dominate the room. Leather chairs were arranged around the hearth in a configuration that felt less casual than it appeared, deliberate. Like everything Adrien touched, he set our bags down and turned to me. His expression, for the first time in days, was entirely unreadable. Not warm, not cold. Simply settled, as if he had finally arrived somewhere he had been moving toward for a long time. "This weekend," he said quietly, "is about honesty. About real connection, about looking at the things most people spend their entire lives learning to avoid." A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The first night passed in a kind of held breath. We sat by the fire, wine in hand, the flames throwing shadows that moved across the walls like restless thoughts. Adrien was present but somehow interior. His attention elsewhere, turned inward or forward, somewhere I couldn't follow. I wanted to ask more. I watched the fire instead. Sleep came slowly, the mountain pressing in from all directions with its ancient, watchful quiet. The second day was deceptive. We walked snow-covered trails in the kind of cold that clarifies everything. The air so sharp it made ordinary thought impossible and simple experience immediate. We laughed. We moved. For hours, the weight I'd been carrying lifted, replaced by the uncomplicated pleasure of being alive in a beautiful place beside someone I loved. I let myself believe, briefly, that I had been overthinking everything. Then evening fell, and with it, the weight returned, heavier, for having briefly disappeared. I was standing near the fire, watching the flames, when I heard the sound. Tires on gravel, the unmistakable crunch of an arrival. Adrien didn't look surprised. He had been expecting this exact moment. "They're here," he said, quietly, almost to himself. 13 men entered the lodge. They came in from the cold with purpose, not hurried, not hesitant, but settled in themselves in a way that immediately altered the atmosphere of the room. Some were young. Some were significantly older. Some carried themselves with polished refinement. Others with the quieter confidence of people who have nothing left to prove. What they shared was harder to name. A stillness. A particular quality of self-possession that filled the space without demanding attention. Their eyes moved through the room and found Adrien. And they waited. What followed was not chaos. It was order, careful, structured, pre-designed. Adrien greeted them with an authority I had seen him exercise in professional settings, but never in anything personal. Introductions were minimal. Words were rationed. I caught names, fragments of personalities, glimpses of lives briefly illuminated. But I was given no explanations. Not yet. Perhaps, not ever. In the direct sense. What unfolded over the next 2 days defied the categories I had available for it. The lodge became its own world, sealed off from ordinary life by mountain and snow and the absence of connectivity. Within that world, unspoken rules governed everything. Honesty was not encouraged. It was assumed. Pretense was not forbidden. It simply had nowhere to survive. Silence, real silence, was sometimes required and always respected. I listened more than I spoke. I observed more than I participated. And slowly, like a landscape emerging from fog, I began to see dimensions of Adrien I had lived beside for 8 years without ever fully perceiving. His capacity for leadership, not the performed kind, but the quiet, gravitational kind that makes people want to move toward rather than away. His understanding of how discomfort, when properly held, creates space for something true to emerge. His belief, fundamental and unshakable, that people only genuinely encounter themselves when the comfortable explanations are removed. I felt it all at once, admiration and fear, trust in its shadow, the terrifying, specific intimacy of being chosen, of understanding that you were placed in a situation precisely because someone believed you could survive it. On the final night, after the others had retreated and the fire had burned down to ember and orange light, Adrien sat beside me in the quiet and said the thing I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. "You could have left," he said. "At any point, you knew that." I thought about it, I admitted, but I needed to understand. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the coals. "That's why I chose you," he said finally. 4 words. And in them, 8 years suddenly rearranged themselves into a shape I hadn't known they were forming. We left the mountains the next morning. The drive down felt nothing like the drive up. The same roads, the same trees, the same cold light pressing through the pines, but I was not the same person who had traveled them 2 days before. Something had shifted in me at a level too deep for easy description. Not broken, not destroyed, transformed in the way that transformation always feels at first, like loss, and then like arrival. Our marriage would not return to what it had been. I understood that completely, sitting in the passenger seat watching the mountains recede behind us. But I also understood, for the first time, that what it had been was never the full story. It was always the preface to something neither of us had had the language to name. Some truths don't announce themselves. They don't arrive in arguments or revelations or the dramatic ruptures that stories usually depend on. They wait, they accumulate, they settle into the architecture of a life so gradually that by the time you see them clearly, they have already become the foundation. And once seen, they cannot be unseen. If this story moved something in you, if it pressed against something you recognize, something you felt in a relationship or in yourself, then you're exactly where you belong. Because this is only one unraveling. There are many more waiting. Subscribe to Seductive Chronicles and let the next story find you.